Dear Millennials, I'm sorry we didn't stop them. And the thing that got me started on this was the statistic that came out of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board or bank, and it is that in the millennial generation and the boomer generation are about the same size right now. The millennial generation is actually just a little bit larger than the boomer generation because boomers are dying off and millennials are just now hitting their 40s. So, or getting into their 40s. But when the boomer generation was in their 30s, back in 1990, when the boomers were in their 30s, in their late 30s in 1990, and I'm a member of that generation, our generation held 21.3% of the nation's wealth, according to the Federal Reserve Bank. 21.3%. Boomers held 1/5 of the wealth in America when we were in our 30s. Today, millennials are in their 30s and early 40s, and millennials, and it's this roughly the same number of people, and millennials hold only 4.6% of the nation's wealth. 21% versus 4.6. It's about a 4-to-1 ratio. Millennials have about 1/4 the wealth that my generation did when we were the age that most millennials are right now, the median age of millennials. How do we get here? What happened? What brought this about? In a word, Republicans. Now, I'll acknowledge that they got a little help from a number of Democrats, but at the bottom line here, the basis of this whole thing, what drove this train was the Reagan Revolution. It's very simple, very straightforward. And it's happened on a whole bunch of levels. The first was wages. Before the break, wages. The Republican Party came for your wages. In the 1990s, the right to work, so-called right to work movement, I call it the right to work for less movement, really started picking up steam. In 1996, the National Right to Work Committee was created, kind of a coalition of businesses, and they started pushing this legislation in state after state. It was legalized in 1947. There was a 2-year period when Republicans controlled Congress in the 1940s. It was the only 2 years between 1932 and I believe the mid-60s that the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. But in 1947, they passed Taft-Hartley, which gave the states the ability to change their laws so that employers could screw unions. And every single right to work for less state right now got their right to work for less laws under a Republican administration. If you look at a map, what you'll see is that the entire West Coast and the entire East Coast north of the slave states, north of the Mason-Dixon line, is still, a place where you can have a union. But the rest of the country, by and large, is right to work for less. So number one, we saw that. And it's just decimated unions. When my dad was, my dad's generation, the 1940s, 80% of workers who petitioned for a union got one. In 1990, my generation, 56% of workers who petitioned for a union got one. I was not able to find numbers. I spent a half hour looking for this yesterday as I was writing this op-ed yesterday afternoon. I was not on what percentage of workers who want a union now get one. If they're out there, they're well buried. But I guarantee it's a hell of a lot lower than 56%. So number one, they came for your wages. Then they came for your right to get an education. Before Reagan became governor of California, the entire University of California system was free. Reagan, as governor, did away with that, saying that he didn't want to sponsor intellectual curiosity of the brats who protest my policies. Then when he became president, he did the same thing at a federal level, cutting federal and ultimately state, as a consequence, support for tuition. When Reagan came into office in 1980, 80% of the college was paid for by state and federal government. 80%. 20% was covered by tuition. So, I didn't graduate from college, but the brief time that I went to college, I paid my way through college working as a dishwasher at Bob's Big Boy and pumping gas at an Esso station. My wife, Louise, who actually did graduate from college, put herself through college working as a waitress at Howard Johnson's. and, riding her bike to work. I mean, this is, what you can do. My mom paid her way through 4 years of MSU, graduated magna cum laude in the 1940s, working a summer job as a lifeguard in Charlevoix, Michigan, where she grew up. I mean, that you could do that back then. Now you've got to get, $100,000 in student debt. So now, your right to an education was taken away by Republicans. Then they went after the entrepreneurs. This is the story of my life. Louise and I have started 7 businesses over the years. And one of them went down in flames. Several of them have been very successful. And you can't do that anymore. I mean, it's still possible, theoretically, to start a business. But, back in the 60s, when we started our first business, it was 1969, we started our first business. It was in East Lansing. We were right around the corner from Grand River Avenue on MIT Avenue, or whatever the MAC Avenue in East Lansing, Michigan, across the street from MSU. Every store, all along this, mile-long strip of Grand River Avenue is the main drag that goes through East Lansing, Michigan. Every store was locally owned. Every business. There was Jacobson's Furniture and Johnson's Pharmacy, and everything was locally owned. Even the mall out in Okemos, the main anchor of the store was Sears, which was a national chain, but most of the stores were locally owned. The jewelry shops, the food shops, the health food stores, everything. Now it's all giant chains. Why? Because in 1983, Ronald Reagan ordered the federal government to stop enforcing the Sherman antitrust law and the other antitrust laws that followed. And here we are. You can't start a business now, you get squashed like a bug. Then they started squeezing you for cash when you got sick or were injured. Medical debt is another burden that the Reagan Revolution brought that has destroyed America. America is the only, in fact, it's so bad, 500,000 Americans every year lose their homes and everything, have to declare bankruptcy because of medical debt. Millions of people have medical debt. Back in the 60s, that first business that Louise and I started in 1969, we had 4 employees. We provided health care to everybody. My recollection is it cost around $30 or $40 a month. It might have been a little more than that, but it wasn't terrible. Why? Because the law at that time required Blue Cross Blue Shield, who we bought our insurance from, to be a nonprofit. And every one of all 3 hospitals in Lansing, Ingham Medical, Sparrow, and St. Lawrence, they were all nonprofits. It was the law. The drug companies were all, there were hundreds of pharmaceutical companies. There were a couple of giants, but most of them were small companies, and drug prices were under control. As the New York Times noted in an article titled "Medical Mystery: Something Happened to U.S. Health Spending After 1980," quote, America was in the realm of other countries in per capita health spending through about 1980. Then it diverged. And then they go on to point out that the same thing happened with mortality, with lifespan. Life expectancy in 1980, the U.S. was right in the middle of the pack with peer nations, says the New York Times, but by the mid-2000s, we were at the bottom of the pack. Yes, we have the highest medical expenses in the world among developed nations and the lowest life expectancy. And then the Kaiser Family Foundation points out, we find 23 million people, nearly 1 in 10 adults, owe significant medical debt. People in the United States owe at least $195 billion in medical debt. And then if the Republicans hadn't, nailed the millennials, speaking to you millennials, if the Republicans hadn't nailed you in all those regards that I've just mentioned, education, wages, health care, they figured out a way to go after your need for a roof over your house. In the 1990s, as part of Gingrich's Contract on America, Congress deregulated the financial services industry, and thus now we've got giant corporations, hedge funds, banks buying, and in some cases, 10, 15, 20% of the housing stock in some towns. And what do? They buy them and then they rent them out. So the price of housing goes through the roof because there's fewer houses available to buy, so people are bidding up prices because of demand, and they're raising rent. The Wall Street Journal just last year did a piece where they documented how in Spring Hill, this is a suburb in Nashville, the average rent for a 3-bedroom house was around $1,000 a month. Wall Street came in, bought up hundreds of houses, And within a year, the average rent was $1,700 a month. It's amazing. I mean, just stripping these neighborhoods. And then, the Republicans came after your wealth in a huge way. They cut the top tax rate on billionaires from 74% down to 27%. Reagan did that. Cut corporate taxes from 50% to practically nothing. So that today, 1/50, 2%, 1/50 of all millennial wealth in America is held by one millennial, Mark Zuckerberg. 1/50 of all the millennial wealth in this country. The average billionaire now pays less than 3% as an income tax rate. And the average corporation, at least the big ones, pays nothing. In fact, they're getting money back. And where are they getting that money from? Your and my taxes. This is a 42-year-long process that started with Ronald Reagan, and it has produced a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the working class of America to the top 1%. $50 friggin' trillion. When Reagan was elected, there wasn't a single billionaire in America. Now we're producing them like popcorn. And it goes on and on and on. Don't get me started about the Republicans right across the board denying climate change. So that as they take their money from the fossil fuel industry, like Russia and Hungary, they're trying to overturn the right to abortion. And did I mention 400 million guns? And then this morning, Republican Senator John Cornyn comes out and says, no, we're not going to do anything more about guns. No, not a chance. Sorry. I'm embarrassed to say this, but my generation, the boomers, did this to your generation, millennials, and Zoomers. And Gen X, too, has been the victims of this. Now, the good news is that boomers and millennials are getting together. You got Bernie Sanders and Sam Lawrence, actually Sherrod Brown, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio just endorsed Sam Lawrence. Sam was on this program just a month or so ago. He's 19 years old. He's running for the Ohio State House, a progressive Democrat. So the boomer generation and the millennial and Zoomer generations are getting together politically. I'm hopeful